In this Warframe guide, I'm gonna give you the best Warframes, weapons, and strategies for solo players, so that even if you're more a lone wolf type of player, you know exactly what you need to dominate all aspects of the game without running into any trouble. As always, big cheers to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. Alright, now, first of all, before we get into the nitty-gritty and all the gear, if you're a new player in Warframe, or you haven't even downloaded the game but you're thinking about maybe giving it a try, you might be wondering, is it even worth it to start playing this game if I'm a solo player? And just to make that very clear and get it out of the way at the beginning of the video, you absolutely can. I, for my part, for example, have spent over 2,000 hours in Warframe, and most of that time was solo, in fact. Without getting so much into the detail, what I could basically sum it up to is 70% of the content in the game is entirely solo playable as a single player experience. Then another 25 or so percent might be a bit tricky without the right equipment if you're just alone, but you can easily manage it if you just go into random matchmaking and play together with 3 randoms. And only 5% of Warframe's content is really optimized for dedicated teams. You know, those type of situations where you want specific roles. This is really only in a few game modes, and those are pretty much optional. If you don't want to engage with them, you don't have to. So if the only thing holding you back from jumping into the game is that you're unsure if it's really worth it as a solo player, then absolutely give it a shot, and with today's tips, you're gonna have it even easier. So let's get right to it. Alright, with that being said, how about we jump in and first talk about the best Warframes for solo play, and then we get to the weapons and all the other types of gear that you need so you have the full picture. And when it comes to Solo Warframe, there is one guy that comes to mind. I also recently published another video on him, and that would be the Eidolon Frame Revenant. Revenant is mostly known to be the invincible Warframe. His second skill, Mesmer Skin, gives you basically a couple of charges as sort of get out of jail free cards, right? If you get hit, you lose one of those charges, but you don't take any damage. Revenant just keeps you dry and safe. So if you, much like me, simply prefer the game style of running and gunning, you know, just want to go in, get at it with your weapon of choice, then Revenant is the man. Now, I know that Revenant is not only the quote-unquote invincible Warframe, but he can do much more than that, and I talked more about it in my recent Revenant video, so if you're interested, make sure to check that out afterwards. But only for simplicity's sake, this right here would be an example build for a gunrunner setup. It will definitely work against pretty much all content in the game, although with Revenant, because he doesn't have that much of a damage buffing ability, you do suffer a bit on the weapon's damage output because there are other frames out there who simply excel more in buffing up your weapon's damage. And that brings us nicely over to the next frame on the list, and that would be Harrow. If you're talking about single player frames, then Harrow is pretty much the #1 on the list. See, he pretty much has it all. He has an ability to give himself shields back, he has an ability that gives himself fire rate and melee attack speed at the same time, he can heal himself, give himself tons of energy, and he can buff up your weapon's crit chance so hard that he can turn pretty much any gun out there into a red critter. Now, the reason that he is, in my opinion, a single-player frame is that he has kind of a bit of an issue, and that is, in order to get all those buffs rolling, Harrow needs to do a lot of the stuff that he does himself. He needs to kill enemies himself in order to get the energy. He needs to take damage himself in order to get the crit chance. And if you're running in multiplayer, especially if you're in there with a competent team, then it can very well happen that the team is just gonna nuke the entire room before you can do anything to get the buffs up and running. However, when you're alone, then, you know, guess what? You can run Harrow. Of course, you could also run Satrine, but I think Harrow does the whole thing a little bit better. This right here would be an example build if I personally want to go in and have some mindless fun, worry not too much about survival, and just have a good time. But as you probably already realized, not all mission types are sunshine and rainbows where you jump in, get 60 kills, and then you're ready to extract. No, many mission types also require you to defend a certain target, whether that being a defense objective, a mobile defense, or an excavator when you're going for cryotic. And if you're like me, then you probably already realized that doing these types of missions solo is about as much fun as going to the dentist if you've had pain for 5 years already. Well, say no more, that is exactly where our next Warframe comes in, and she comes in very strong because we're talking about Zephyr. Now, I've said it once and I say it again, Zephyr is an insanely underrated Warframe. She is super versatile, especially in stationary types of missions like defense, mobile defense, or excavation. Because A, she has a grouping ability, which is super cool. She has a skill that makes her completely invincible against all types of bullets coming in, so that's great. And with her ultimate, she creates tornadoes where the enemies get sucked in and then you can take care of them as much as you like. And the special thing about her is, if you mod her for a bit more range, you can just stand on top of any defense target, and the windshield that she creates around herself with the skill that redirects bullets, that windshield is actually so big that it not only covers you, but also all allies and defense targets that you're standing on top of. So, long story short, with Zephyr, you can just start your defense mission, stand on top of the cryopod, and wait for the enemies to come. They can hardly do anything. But Warframe is, at the end of the day, a looter shooter, and you will need a lot of resources to build all the nice and shiny Warframes and weapons that you would like to play. That means any good solo account will need a Warframe that helps with farming. So, the next one I would recommend is either Hydroid, Necros, or Korra. Those three have specific abilities that help with enemy looting and increase the drop chance for resources or whatever else the enemy might have with them. My personal favorite here would be Korra because I find her most convenient to play in comparison to the other two, but really, at the end of the day, if you have one of those three, you're probably good. Now, the way that Korra works is actually pretty simple. You put up your Strangle Dome, ideally with a lot of range, and enemies get caught in that. Then you need to use the augment mod Pilfering Strangle Dome, which increases the drop chance of enemies when they're killed while hanging in that Strangle Dome. This is pretty easy to achieve because if you use her first skill against the Strangle Dome, you will deal damage to all enemies currently affected by it. This way, you can nuke away quite a lot of enemies in one hit and afterwards collect all their loot. So much for farming resources. But another aspect of Warframe is just running through missions quickly, right? Maybe you're farming a specific relic in a capture mission and all you're interested in is just get into the mission as quickly as possible, get out, and repeat. So I think when you're solo, one thing you definitely need is a speed-running Warframe. And here we again have two options, either Vault or Wukong. The reason Wukong is so good for this is pretty obvious. He can turn into a cloud and then freely fly through the tile set, so you're not obstructed by any types of items or anything else that is in the way. You can just fly through and even get through enemy security doors like this. However, I personally would recommend Vault because while Wukong is not bad, not at all, Vault is simply so much more versatile. Talking about which niches he can fill would probably be one entire video in and of itself, so I'm just gonna say Vault has a great set of abilities, and of course one of them is that he makes himself and his attack speed and all that type of stuff faster, so if you want to speedrun missions, then having a Vault in your arsenal is never gonna disappoint. But what if you simply want to kill a lot of stuff fast, right? You want to go and nuke the entire tile set in just a couple of seconds. In this case, I personally would recommend Dante. Dante is a great Warframe. He combines amazing offensive with defensive capabilities. In order to survive, he can give himself and the team a lot of overguard, and then in terms of offense, he can cast his Dark Verse and combine that with his ultimate ability, Final Verse, to deal absolutely ludicrous amount of slash damage to pretty much everybody in the room. And finally, there's one activity that you're probably going to do a whole lot, and that is leveling weapons and Warframes. While for Warframe leveling, you cannot really pick another Warframe because, you need to use the Warframe that you're actually leveling. When it comes to weapon leveling, there are actually two that do the same job and they do it very well. Those being Banshee and Sevagoth. See, the thing that we're going to do here is basically the same for both Warframes. We're going to use Banshee's skill Silence in combination with Sevagoth's skill Gloom. Since both of these skills are available through the Helminth, it doesn't matter whether you go Banshee and infuse Sevagoth's Gloom or go Sevagoth and infuse Banshee Silence on him. You're just gonna pick one of the two. And then, what you're gonna do is go into an Exterminate mission, ideally against Grineer, and then the magic happens. See, I've talked about this in detail in my dedicated leveling guide, so I'm not going to waste all too much of your time here, but what it boils down to is that the combination of Banshee's Silence and Sevagoth's Gloom leads to the enemy AI being temporarily disabled, so that if you kill them, they don't really notice that, and therefore you get a stealth affinity multiplier, giving you up to 5 times the experience per kill that you would usually get. With a little bit of patience and skill, you can run through those exterminate missions and easily level your entire weapon from level 0 to level 30 in just one solo exterminate run. And before we talk about the weapons now, I would greatly appreciate it that if the video has helped you so far, you could leave a like because it helps big time with the YouTube algorithm. I see it every time, so cheers so much for all of your support. But now, let's take a look at some guns, shall we? Now, when it comes to weapons, I don't want to steal all that much of your time because I've done multiple videos on the best types of weapons for different scenarios in the game already. But anyway, here are some suggestions that I find really useful on a day-to-day basis, and I run them all the time. Starting out with probably the best assault rifle in the entire game, and that would be the Fenmore. The Fenmore, being an Incarnon weapon, is something that you will unlock later down the line, but anyway, if you're not there yet, that's no problem. You could look into any other of my top 10 weapon lists for beginners, for mid-game players, for endgame players, whatever floats your boat, and pick one of the assault rifles there that you find useful. As for the Fenmore, it is just so incredibly strong in terms of damage that it blasts away everything that gets into its sights. Normal enemies? Say no more. Kuva Liches, Acolytes? Absolutely no problem, and even if you're going and hunting for Archons, then the Fenmore is pretty much your best friend. I will put you up a build and the evolutions that I personally use for it on screen right now, and I can only highly recommend that you give it a shot for yourself if you haven't already. But while the Fenmore is certainly great, there is another Incarnon weapon that very much floats my boat, and that would be the Torrid Incarnon. See, while the Fenmore is great for single target damage and puts down a lot of dedicated damage downrange, in many situations you're just swarmed by multiple enemies, so you need a bit of a group clearing capability. And if that's what you're looking for, then the Torrid Incarnon is probably going to be the best weapon in the game. This one you will also find in my top 10 rifle list of 2024, so I spare you all the details and just give you the build and the evolutions right here, but just note that this thing is an absolute beast. It doesn't do as much single target damage, especially against tougher foes like Archons, but then again, if you're going for that, you can just always rock the Fenmore and have no problem. I think these two guns are great on every account because they really help compensate for each other's strengths and weaknesses. If, by the way, you're not that far into the game that you can have the Torrid Incarnon as of right now, what you could go for instead would be the Tenet Galaxion. This one, while being a bit weaker than the Torrid, does the same thing and also has pretty good performance. As for beginners, you even also have an option that is kind of similar like that, and that would be the secondary weapon called a Tomos, available at Mastery Rank 5. This one, just like the Tenet Galaxion and the Torrid Incarnon, also fires a beam that links to multiple enemies on hit and therefore has crowd clearing capabilities. If you mod it right, it can easily carry you through the entire star chart. But alright, so much for your primary weapons for day-to-day combat or for hunting down bigger types of enemies. When I go and put together a single-player loadout, then usually those types of weapons, those primaries, are my main source of damage, and when it comes to the secondary slot, I don't go for a pistol that is meant to do damage, but rather I pick a secondary weapon that is meant to support the damage output of my melee or my primary weapon, whatever is my main damage source. Those types of secondaries are called primers, and their purpose is not to deal damage, but to apply different status effects to your enemies that will then lead to your main source of damage, aka in this case our primary weapon, to deal much more damage. And when it comes to primers, there are a select few very great options that I want to present to you now. First of all, and this is probably the number one since it came out, would be the Kuva Nukor. The Kuva Nukor is a Kuva weapon and therefore comes from Kuva Liches, and how it works is pretty much the same way as the Torrid Incarnon. You shoot an enemy and then you hit multiple targets at the same time because the beam is linking to nearby foes. And the special thing about the Kuva Nukor is that it has a lot of different status effects initially, but can be modded into even more of that, and all of this is combined with a very high fire rate and an insane status chance. So with this one, you're putting out so many status effects, it's like lighting up your screen with all the symbols that will pop up. But if you're not that far into the game that you can get it for yourself, no problem, because guess what? Also here, the Atomos that I talked about previously, it can not only be used as a primary source of damage to replace your Torrid Incarnon, it's also a great primer and can fulfill the same role as the Kuva Nukor. And thirdly, when it comes to those types of linking beam weapons, I also again want to talk about the Tenet Galaxion, because this one, if you want to use your primary weapon as a primer, can also be used very well since it deals at base cold damage, and having a primer that can deal cold to an enemy will probably be pretty meta very soon. And then another weapon that should be mentioned here would be the Epitaph, because this one, while not being a beam weapon, is an explosive AoE weapon that not only deals cold, but also radiation damage and can be modded for even more damage types to prime enemies in a larger AoE in front of you. But so much for guns. Let's talk about melees right now, shall we? And when it comes to melees, I personally have two different approaches. Either I go for a dedicated melee build, where I use my melee weapon to deal the most damage possible, or I keep my melee weapon as a sort of emergency tool in the backpack if a big foe enters, like an acolyte comes around the corner. Then I pull out the melee, and it will simply be used to deal a big finishing blow to those tougher types of enemies to get them out of the way real quick, and then I would go and swap back to my primary weapon. Now, since I've made a video on the best melee weapons in the game already last year, and probably pretty soon I'm also going to put out an updated 2024 version, I don't want to get too much into the quote-unquote main damage dealer type of melee here, but instead rather elaborate a bit more on the finisher type that I talked about earlier. So, what are you going to do? Well, pretty simple. You do go for bleeds, but you're going to make sure that those bleeds that you do deal are so heavy that inflicting 4 will be more than enough. The way I like to do this is with heavy hitting / inflicting melee weapons. Here are my favorites. On the one hand, we have the Hate, or if you don't have that, the Reaper Prime pretty much also does the job. These two are scythes, and the special thing about the scythe weapon type is that when you do a heavy attack with them, they force proc a slash, and they have the highest multiplier out of all the melee weapon classes for those heavy attacks. That means whenever you want to dispose of an enemy really quickly, one of your high priority targets, like necromechs, like acolytes, like demolisher units in interception missions for example, pulling out one of those usually will get the job done in just a couple of seconds. In case you don't have a scythe at your disposal right now, it's not all that bad, because you could also alternatively go for an Akana type weapon. Those also have a pretty good multiplier on their heavy attacks, and they are a bit more widely available in the game. So yeah, this is usually how I run my setups. My main source of damage will be the primary weapon that is either highly focused on single target, like the Fenmore, or on crowd clearing, like the Torrid Incarnon. Then the secondary will be the primer to help the primary deal more damage, and in the melee slot, I have my heavy hitter against those high priority targets that I want to get out of the way as soon as possible. That's all about the weapons, but for a solo player, there is more to know, especially when it comes to which companions to use, because they have a huge impact, as well as which Helminth abilities you should unlock, because they work great on solo loadouts. So how about we quickly talk about the Helminth abilities first, and then get to the companions. Okay, now for the Helminth abilities, I also want to keep it a bit short because guess what, I've produced a lot of videos, but I recently also produced a long video where I listed every single Helminth ability in the entire game on a tier list from S to D, so if you want to get the full picture, this is the place to go. As for the best Helminth abilities for solo players, I would first off definitely recommend having Roar, because Rhino is not only easy to get very early in the game, so you can have access to that ability, but it also is the most universal damage buff in the entire game. It buffs your weapons, it buffs your abilities, it counts as faction damage, so it has some really big potential for damage over time effects, and generally, going for Rhino's Roar is usually always a good option. But of course, I also mentioned that armor on high-level enemies usually tends to be a problem later on in the game, and the next two skills help with that. Those being Tharo Strike from Styanax and Pillage from Hildryn. Tharo Strike is overall just really great. You shoot out Styanax's shields and he strips away enemy armor and shields. I think I don't have to say much more, right? As for Pillage, Pillage does pretty much the same thing, but it needs more ability strength to full strip. However, on the flip side, this at the same time fills up your personal shields, so it's kind of a enemy defense reduction plus shield refill for you at the same time. Then, also one thing that every account should have in my opinion is something to refill your Warframe's energy. And when it comes to that job, my personal recommendations would be Fractured Blast from Citrine or Grendel's Nourish, which is like the GOAT, the skill that everybody always uses for energy because it is simply that good. And finally, there's another one that I want to talk about real quick, and that would be Gauss's Thermal Sunder. Now, why Gauss's Thermal Sunder? Well, because it can help you speed level your Warframes. See, the way I level my Warframes, and also one of the fastest solo leveling ways for Warframes in the entire game, would be going into Sanctuary Onslaught and getting as many kills as possible with your Warframe. Problem here usually is that not all Warframes have a damage dealing ability that is capable of AoE nuking an entire room. And this is exactly where Thermal Sunder comes in. If you throw that into the first ability slot of whatever Warframe you're trying to level, you can use it in the Sanctuary Onslaught, nuke the room, get a lot of kills, and therefore speed level your Warframe in a very, very fast way. Just make sure to mod it for a lot of range so you hit more foes at the same time. And finally, when it comes to building a strong solo account, the last piece of the puzzle would be getting the right companions. Believe it or not, companions make all the difference in the world now. They're so strong, they're buffing us up, they're helping us stay alive, they're weakening the enemies. They are doing so much, more even than some teammates could do. One of my top recommendations for companions would be the Panzerwalperpfeiler. The whole thing about the Panzer is basically they can spread viral effects throughout the entire room in a way that works pretty much the same way as Sarin Spores do, just that for the Panzer, they deal viral and not corrosive. And given the fact that viral makes the enemy so much more susceptible to your damage, this is one of the things that you always want to have, right? Viral priming is pretty much the thing that every player wants to achieve, and the Panzerwalperpfeiler does that for you, so you don't even have to pull out your primer weapon for that. Then, another must-have in my opinion would be the Smida Kavat, because it can help you not only speed leveling, but also resource farming. See, the Smita has a mod called Charm, and what this does is it gives the Smita the option to bestow you with a buff that doubles your resource gain rate, doubles your affinity gain rate, and also your credit income for 2 minutes. Whenever you run a farming mission, whenever you're going for speed leveling, always make sure to bring your Smida Kavat in because it can help you so much. Another great one would be Diriga. I've talked about it in so many videos already, and I'm gonna say it again. Diriga, with its mod Arc Coil, in combination with Manifold Bond, is able to constantly restore your shields, constantly prime nearby enemies with all different types of status effects, and it's just overall one of the best companions in the entire game. And finally, especially when you're going for a melee setup and you want to group up your enemies so that you can kill them all at once, Nautilus is probably worth a try, or maybe even your companion of choice. With its mod Cordon, it occasionally pulls together enemies in one spot, like a grouping ability, and then you can use that to your advantage by hammering into that group and getting some nice multi-kills out of it. This is pretty much Nautilus's main feature, and while I personally, subjectively am not that much of a fan of Nautilus, a lot of people in the community absolutely love this little guy, so it would be silly for me to not put him on the list. And if you feel like you need more info on the best Warframes in the game, then don't miss this video right here with the top dogs of 2024. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtle Beer, Shadow Soul, Pepperwolf, Ondakanyo 2, Misfire DX, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.